Also important here in the mid to late 20th century has to do with how religion is being taught. So in the middle of the 20th century, a variety of court cases are decided by the Supreme Court that essentially remove the teaching of religion from public schools. Some of that, I think, was good. Some of that, I think, was negative. Right? So I'm not totally against that taking place, but I'm not totally for it either. Because in one sense, you know, would I want a Catholic teaching my child Catholic doctrine if I were sending them to a public school? I mean, if I'm sending them to a Catholic school, you got to expect that, right? But if I'm sending them to a public school, do I want a Catholic or a Jew or you know, somebody from another religion teaching my child about religion? I would say no, that's my job. But on the other hand, I think the loss of religion in public schools, or at least talking about religion, and the fear of talking about religion, I think has damaged our society as well. But essentially, you know, what has happened is that there was this kind of removal from the teaching of, you know, having a Bible reading, having prayer in public schools. And since then, there's been this confusion about what to do. How can you talk about it? But with the Supreme Court, what they did decide was that while you couldn't have a Bible reading, right, to kind of start off today, while you couldn't have a prayer, even if you thought it was a non-sectarian prayer, meaning it didn't favor the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Methodists or the Jews, if you didn't pray in Jesus' name, that way you don't offend Jews, right? While you couldn't do that, you could teach the Bible as literature, right? And so, you know, I mean, when you look at the King James Version, even if you don't accept it as the inspired Word of God, that's a fantastic product of English literature, right? And for the time period, really, you know, it's really kind of interesting. And so there were some ways in which it was said that publicly sponsored places could still talk about religion, but in a very narrow sense, in the sense of exploring what do people believe and think as opposed to what you should believe or think. And so you have the development in public universities, state schools of religious studies departments. And so the teaching of the Bible and biblical studies has been largely relegated to seminaries, right? Minister training schools of a variety of denominations. But with public universities are now getting in on it. You know, so you can go to a wide variety of public universities and major in religion and even study biblical studies. It's going to be taught from a very skeptical standpoint, right? A lot of the people that teach biblical studies in public universities are skeptics, atheists, agnostics. But you have this kind of teaching the Bible that takes place. And so here you have quite a big difference, right? I got my PhD at Florida State. We have Department of Religion at Florida State. One of the things that you can concentrate in your PhD is the religions of Western antiquity, right? Christianity, Judaism. Mine's in American religious history, so I didn't take much of those courses. But you can take Introduction to the New Testament, Introduction to the Old Testament at Florida State. But what you get there compared to what you would get here is quite different. I mean, we talk about those kind of things like the 4-source, the 2-source, the documentary hypothesis, all that kind of stuff. We'll tell you, you know, in greater detail than what I've done about why we don't have to accept them, right? Or how they can be understood yet still uphold inspiration. But you're not going to get that at a public university. And so here you are. You're wanting to major in engineering, and so you go to a Florida State, or you go to an Alabama, or you go to wherever, right? And you see, you know, as a Christian, Introduction to the Old Testament. Man, that sounds like a good class. It fulfills a requirement, you know, and you know, as a Christian, I'm interested in the Old Testament, or I'm interested in the New Testament. And you go here, and you're thrown all this stuff that would destroy your faith. Instead of talking about those in a faith-safe perspective like we're doing, there's not that protection. And so a lot of people go there, hear all these kinds of things, and lose their faith. And so you see biblical studies, you have, on the one hand, you have those Jews and Christians who approach the Bible from an academic standpoint, but do so within the context of faith. They have their own personal faith, and they're studying them that way. And then you have a lot of agnostics and atheists who look at the Bible not caring about the truth, believing it's not true. And then finally, in our overview here, you get to the point of the development in the late 20th century of a variety of theologies, contextual theologies, as we talked about. Things like feminist theology, liberation theology, looking at the text through the eyes of specific concerns. So liberation theology develops largely in Central and South America. That's kind of where it starts off. Particularly thinking about the oppression that those people and still do face from some of the governments down there. Very dictatorial governments in a lot of places. And so liberation theology kind of develops as a way to focus. Well, the claims were that the Bible's message is one of liberation. I think that's probably true on the surface of it, but largely the focus was an economic focus. Right? And so there's a lot of Marxist influence here on liberation theology about the relationship between upper class and lower class and how the Bible relates in there. But essentially the focus of liberation theology was to preach to the oppressed people. Feminist theology, of course, was shaped by a lot of the concerns of women in the later 20th century, and thinking about what does the Bible say positively about women, and thinking about the role that women had both throughout time and in in the present. So, re-examining some of the texts that were used to support the subordination of women, the subjection of women, looking at notable women in the Bible, how does the Bible represent women, and thinking about male power. Right? These are the concerns that feminist theologians brought to the table when they were thinking about, feminist theology development. Today, we have a wide variety of things going on in biblical studies. Largely, a lot of that shaped by the different things that we have here. And introducing them in this historical way, I haven't had the chance to maybe refute all of some of these ideas, but it's important for you as you get started, for a lot of you getting started, you'll come across this kind of stuff. As you read for papers, as you read some of your textbooks even. And so I just kind of want to, part of the reason to start here is to kind of give you an advanced knowledge of this, right? So you're ready to see. There's going to be some things sometimes that you read that you shouldn't necessarily accept because it's coming from a place of skepticism versus a place of faith. Even though we've spent 2 classes on it, it's been 10,000 level overview versus getting in the trenches all the time. What questions do you have? Anything where I might explain or clarify a little bit more? All right, so let's begin to shift into then, and we're just going to get started with this today, and next week we'll get into it a little bit more deeply. Shifting from the academic side to now shifting to some things about ministry and some perspectives in ministry, especially as I want you to think about, you're preparing to, the end of September, write the first draft of your philosophy of ministry. And so we're going to talk next Monday, next Wednesday, Lord willing, about some of the things that go into a philosophy of ministry, and some of the things that that are going to shape your thinking about philosophy of ministry. But as we begin to think about that, one of the things that I think it's important to recognize is that your views on ministry are a small part of a larger aspect of life known as a worldview. And I think it's very important for all of us who are engaged in any sort of ministry, any sort of thing dealing with, trying to communicate the Christian faith, to spend some time thinking about how does my worldview shape how I think about ministry, what my place is, what my role is, what ministry is all about, what ministry should accomplish. And some of these greater concepts than the day-to-day of here's how you preach a sermon, here's how you prepare for a Bible lesson, here's how you do a funeral, or here's some counseling tips if you're going to be a youth and family minister or something like that. So some of these larger questions. So what is a worldview? There's a lot of, you can find a variety of definitions of worldview, but I think that, this is one that's a pretty good start. A worldview is an articulation of the basic beliefs embedded in a shared grand story that are rooted in a faith commitment and that give shape and direction to the whole of our individual and corporate lives. So there are a couple of things here that I think are important for us to take apart. You don't necessarily need to get that whole definition, and I can post the slides on Blackboard, that way you have that. But I do want to emphasize some of those concepts, and so you'll get them on these next couple of slides. First of all, a worldview deals with your basic beliefs. What is it that you think, looking at your life, are the most important, the basic beliefs that ground who you are and what you think your role is in this universe? What's the meaning of your life? What are those basic beliefs? Well, provided, you think about all of us as being Christian, there's probably some things that are going to be basic and common to all of us. But there's going to probably be some things where there's differences, and those differences can be shaped by a variety of things. We might have some religious differences, right? We might come from different varieties of churches or denominations. Our background, our family background, maybe certain things were emphasized more in our families than others. Our social economic status, right? Depending on whether you grew up low class, middle class, upper class, that's going to have an impact on some of those basic beliefs that you have about life and purpose and those kind of things. But a worldview has to do with those basic beliefs. But those basic beliefs are often represented in a shared grand story. For many of us, if not all of us, there is a grand story or a grand narrative that shapes our life whether we realize it or not. Now, hopefully, if you're a Christian, it's the Christian grand narrative, right? The grand story of where the world comes from and how the world works. But a worldview has a grand overarching narrative that describes those kind of basic beliefs. And that grand story, those basic beliefs are embedded in that grand story. Worldviews, however, require a faith commitment. Because often a lot of the questions that are answered by worldview or shaped by worldview are questions related to faith. Even an atheist has a worldview, and the atheist worldview involves a faith commitment. You cannot be 100% sure, absolutely, that God exists. God doesn't exist. Because God is supernatural. So you cannot, science cannot prove whether God exists or not. Now, it might lead you in one way, depending on where you already stand, right? If you already believe God doesn't exist, you're going to look at science and say, oh, these things prove it. Well, they really don't. But you have a faith commitment. You believe in those things. You trust that those things are true. And those basic beliefs, that narrative, shapes us as individuals, but it also shapes the communities that we're a part of. And now, what's important here, though, is that sometimes some of these things overlap. Because as a Christian, you could have your Christian worldview, but the Christian worldview, if you would really sit down and write out your worldview and talk about everything and compare that with somebody from southern part of Africa who identifies as Christian, there's going to be some slightly different things because we're American Christians versus South African Christians, right? So there's going to be some things within that culture that are going to shape Christians in that culture, and there's certain things in our culture that shape Christians. So there's going to be places where that worldview overlaps because of accepting the Bible, accepting that Jesus is the way to God, those kind of things. But then there are going to be some things that are slightly different because of nationality. But when you look at Christians within a congregation in the United States, that worldview shapes the life of that congregation. So it's not just about the individual, it's often about these communities that people are a part of as well. Next time, Lord willing, we'll get into what is the Christian worldview? What is the Christian grand story? And how does that shape our outlook on ministry? And what ministry is meant to do and why we minister. So Lord willing, we'll pick that up again on Monday.